A razor-edged wind sliced through Eleanor Vance's worn-out woolen dress as she stumbled along the iron-hard, rutted track. Her children clung to her skirts, two small anchors in a turbulent sea of white. Samuel, her son of 8 years, fought to appear brave, his young jaw set in a determined line, but the tremor in his fingers gave away his fear. Annalise, a year his junior, had exhausted her tears long ago. Her delicate face, framed by a riot of pale curls, was a mask of ghostly white. The girl's lips, once the soft pink of a summer rose, were now chapped and tinged with blue. Behind them, the farmhouse stood as a dark sentinel against the bruised sky, a place she had once believed was her home, ever since her union with Thomas. Now it was a sepulchre, inhabited by the cold, disdainful faces of her husband's family. Souls who had once offered warm embraces and professed to be her own kin. The instant Thomas had breathed his last, their shallow pity had curdled into open contempt. She possessed no right to their shelter, they had declared, no claim to the provisions or the solace of their hearth. A widow was a mere encumbrance, and her 2 hungry children only compounded the burden. The resounding slam of the barn door had punctuated their exile, its echo swallowed by the desolate landscape. Snow, churned and unforgiving, bit at their ankles as Eleanor pushed onward, her boots threatening to disintegrate with every step. She had no destination, only the primal instinct to keep moving. The sky was a leaden canopy, pregnant with the threat of another blizzard. Along the narrow path ahead, trees stretched their skeletal limbs, swaying like the gnarled fingers of some unearthly phantom. Eleanor pulled Annalise tighter against her chest as the gale shrieked, each forward motion a desperate struggle against the very earth, as if the land itself had joined her in-laws in their conspiracy to devour her whole. Samuel walked beside her, his silence a heavy weight. His cheeks were raw, his knuckles crimson from being clenched so fiercely. He had not uttered a word since they had been cast out, not even when his aunt had cruelly ripped the blanket from his grasp before shutting the door in his face. "I can carry her," Samuel said suddenly, his voice a ragged whisper. "You're weary." Eleanor's heart constricted. He was just a boy, a child who ought to have been whiling away the hours by a warm fireplace, not volunteering to bear his sister through a wilderness that seemed intent on their demise. She managed a faint smile, shaking her head. "I'm fine, my love. Just stay near." The track coiled and vanished into the timber. The deeper they ventured, the more profound the silence became, broken only by the brittle crunch of ice under their feet and the hoarse rasp of their own breathing. By midday, a deep ache had settled into their bones, and their stomachs were hollow with a gnawing hunger. Eleanor fought to think of anything but the relentless emptiness clawing at her insides. Their last meal, 2 days prior, had been a dry crust of bread, a final token of pity before the door had sealed their fate. Annalise began to whimper. Eleanor pressed her lips to her child's forehead. It was far too cold, a sign of her waning strength. "Not much further," she murmured, the words a desperate prayer she wasn't sure she believed. Samuel stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. He gritted his teeth, angrily swiping a hand across his face. Eleanor swallowed the knot of grief in her throat. "We will rest soon, find some shelter." But where? The land unfurled before them, an endless, indifferent expanse of white. The towering trees offered no sanctuary from the cold that gnawed at their very marrow. A crow cawed in the distance. Samuel tugged at her sleeve. "There!" She followed his pointing finger, a small structure barely visible on a distant ridge and half swallowed by the trees. A trading post. Hope, sharp and sudden, flared within her chest. With a surge of renewed purpose, they staggered towards the derelict building. The wood was warped by time, the door clinging precariously to its rusted hinges. Eleanor braced herself and threw her shoulder against it. The door groaned in protest, finally yielding. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Shelves, mostly barren, lined the walls, and a few splintered crates were strewn across the floorboards. In one corner stood a stone fireplace, long cold, but its structure was sound. She gently set Annalise down, wrapping the child in what little fabric remained of her own shawl. Samuel was already sifting through the detritus. "Anything?" she asked, her voice thin. "Not much," he conceded, holding up a cracked bottle and a small pouch. "Some dried beans. Nothing more." Eleanor nodded. It would have to be enough. She turned her focus to the fireplace. If she could conjure a flame, they might see another dawn. Her hands, stiff and clumsy with cold, fumbled for the flint she had managed to take from the farmhouse. The first strike produced a spark, but the tinder was damp. She tried again, and then again. A spark caught. A tiny ember glowed for a heart-stopping moment and then winked out. Desperation was a physical pain. She struck the flint with greater force. The ember brightened, smoke curled, and then a flame. She let out a shuddering breath, cupping her hands around the fragile fire as it licked at the wood. Slowly, a tentative warmth began to permeate the freezing air. Annalise stirred, pressing closer to the flickering light. Samuel sat beside her, hugging his knees to his chest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. Outside, the wind howled, and the walls of the old post creaked under the strain. Something moved in the shadows. Eleanor went rigid, a low growl. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Samuel stiffened beside her. The growl came again, nearer this time. She grabbed a rusted blade she had found among the debris, her grip white-knuckled. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to run, no place of safety. The door, still slightly ajar, trembled in the wind. A silhouette passed the opening. Not human, a wolf. Eleanor pressed a hand over Annalise's mouth as the child began to stir. Samuel's breathing was shallow, his wide eyes fixed on the doorway. The wolf tested the air, its snout lifted. Another blast of wind shook the building, and the creature took a step inside. Eleanor's grip on the blade tightened. If it came for them, she would fight. The wolf emitted a low, rumbling snarl, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Its coat was thick, dusted with frost. It took another step, then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it pivoted and melted back into the night. Silence descended. Eleanor exhaled, her hands trembling violently. Samuel swallowed hard. "Do you think it will return?" she confessed. "I don't know." They did not sleep. The fire dwindled to embers, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on their weary eyes. The wind never ceased its assault, and Eleanor knew in her very bones that this was merely the beginning of their ordeal. Dawn finally broke, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and lavender. As she stared at the rising sun, exhaustion, a crushing weight on her shoulders, a shadow fell across the doorway. Tall, silent, a figure stood there, observing them. Her breath caught. Not a wolf, not a bandit, something else entirely. The man stood silhouetted in the doorway. His features were obscured by the low morning light. Eleanor's body went taut, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs as she clutched Annalise tighter. Samuel pressed against her, his small fingers digging into the worn fabric of her dress. The man was tall and broad of shoulder, wrapped in thick furs that smelled of pine and cold earth. His long, dark hair was woven into a single braid that rested against his chest. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scrutinized them with a quiet, unnerving intensity. A bow was slung across his back, and a sheathed knife was strapped to his hip. He did not speak. Eleanor's grip on the rusted blade tightened, though she was keenly aware of what a pathetic defense it would be against such a man. The fire had burned down to a weak flicker between them, its light casting shadows that danced across his impassive face. He could end them if he chose, and there would be no meaningful struggle, no hope of escape. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, slowly, he reached into the folds of his furs and withdrew a small bundle. He took a single step into the room, placed it on the dirt floor, and then retreated. Eleanor hesitated, every muscle in her body coiled. The bundle, wrapped in rough-spun cloth, lay between them. Samuel shifted beside her, his voice a mere whisper. "What is it?" She didn't reply, forcing herself to move, inching forward while keeping her eyes locked on the man. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bundle and peeled back the cloth. Dried meat, a flask of water, a provision. She swallowed hard. Her gaze lifted to meet his. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable, his posture unwavering. She expected a demand, a price to be named for this charity, an order, a trade, a warning, but nothing came. She had learned to distrust kindness. It was always conditional, a tool people used like a weapon, only to withdraw it when it no longer served their purpose. Yet there was no cruelty in his gaze, no hint of amusement or malice, only a quiet expectation. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He gave no indication he had heard her. Instead, he turned and stepped back toward the door, as if satisfied by some unspoken transaction that had just occurred. "Wait!" she called out, the word escaping her before she could stop it, surprising even herself. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Eleanor faltered, her throat suddenly dry, the words she wanted to say caught and refusing to form. She wanted to ask him why he had offered aid, why he had left them this sustenance instead of simply walking away. Instead, she found herself clutching the food tighter, as if it might vanish the moment he did. The man didn't press her for an explanation. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before disappearing back into the morning mist. She did not see him for 2 more days. The food, portioned out with painstaking care, lasted longer than she'd thought possible. Annalise gained some of her strength, the hollows in her cheeks less pronounced. Samuel ate in silence, his eyes frequently darting toward the door, waiting. Eleanor admonished herself not to hope. The second time he appeared, she did not flinch. He entered without hesitating, stepping inside as though he had already concluded they were no threat. The wind howled at his back, carrying the biting promise of more snow. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, willing her voice to remain steady. "Who are you?" He glanced at her, then toward the fire, as if weighing his response. At last his voice, rough-edged and low, broke the silence. "Kaelin." The name hung in the air between them, unfamiliar but solid. He crouched by the hearth, holding his hands out to the meager warmth, his movements slow and deliberate. Samuel watched him with a wary fascination, his fingers tightening on his knees. Kaelin's gaze shifted to the boy. "You are strong." Samuel blinked. The words, so simple, carried a weight of recognition. He sat up a little straighter and gave a hesitant nod. "Why are you helping us?" Eleanor asked. Kaelin didn't answer right away. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a bundle of cured animal skins. Without a word, He offered them to her. Eleanor paused, then accepted them. They were soft, thick, and impossibly warm. She swallowed. "You are giving us these?" "You have need of them." It was a simple statement of fact, with no expectation of gratitude or repayment. She gripped the furs, feeling their latent heat against her frozen fingers. "I don't understand. You do not know us." Kalen's gaze flickered back to the fire. "I know hunger." The words settled between them with a heavy finality. She studied him then, more closely. The quiet economy of his posture, the way he wasted no movement, the sharp awareness in his eyes. He was a man who had witnessed more than he would ever speak of. Silence fell again, but it was different this time, less suffocating. When Kalen finally rose, adjusting the strap of his satchel, Eleanor found herself speaking before she could second-guess the impulse. "Where are you going?" He met her eyes, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "To hunt." She hesitated. "Will you return?" A beat of silence passed. Then he nodded once. Samuel, for the first time in days, smiled. Kalen came back the following evening with the spoils of his hunt, a rabbit, skinned and cleaned, its meat a welcome sight. He handed it to Eleanor wordlessly, watching her as she blinked in stunned silence. That night, for the first time in a long time, they ate well. The days passed. The snowfall intensified, blanketing the world in a pristine, unending white. Kalen did not leave. At first, he would only appear in the evenings, his presence a quiet, grounding force in their makeshift shelter. But as winter tightened its icy grip and the cold became a relentless siege, he stayed for longer periods. He spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He showed Samuel how to fashion snares, how to set them with patience and precision. He brought firewood, stacking it neatly against the far wall. One evening, as Eleanor struggled to mend a tear in her dress with numb fingers, Callan took the needle from her hand and finished the task himself. She didn't know what to make of him. The fear she had clung to so tightly, the distress that had burned in her chest, was slowly dissipating, replaced by a feeling she could not yet name. Annalise had grown fond of him quickly. She would sit beside him, watching with wide, curious eyes as he sharpened his knife. He allowed it, never speaking, never pressuring her. Samuel followed him with a quiet reverence, mimicking his movements, eager to absorb his knowledge. And Eleanor, for the first time in what felt like an age, was not afraid. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Callan shifted, his gaze meeting hers from across the flames. "Winter will not be gentle." She nodded. "It never is." His eyes held hers. "You cannot remain here." She swallowed. "I have nowhere else to go." A pause. "Come with me." The words sent a jolt through her. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but found only a quiet certainty. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." She looked at her children. Annalise had curled up against the furs, her breathing soft and even. Samuel sat beside him, his hands now calloused, his eyes older than they should be. A choice. She exhaled slowly, her hands tightening on the fabric in her lap. The wind howled outside, the fire burned low, and Eleanor, for the first time in what felt like an age, felt a fragile stirring deep within her chest. Hope. The journey from the abandoned trading post was arduous, each step taking them deeper into the untamed wilderness, further from the life they had once known. Snow crunched underfoot, the effort of walking through it a heavy burden on Eleanor's weary legs. Samuel walked close to Callan, emulating his careful, deliberate stride, while Annalise rode securely on the warrior's back, her small hands clutching the thick furs that covered his shoulders. Eleanor maintained a slight distance, watching him as they moved, trying to decipher the quiet strength in his gait, the way he moved almost soundlessly despite his size. His presence was unsettling in a way she couldn't articulate. He had given her no cause for alarm, and yet fear had been her constant companion for so long that it refused to relinquish its hold easily. The wind intensified, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The forest grew more dense, the towering trees forming a canopy that blocked out the pale gray sky. The deeper they went, the more Eleanor understood how utterly lost she would have been without Callan's guidance. There were no paths here, no landmarks, only an endless expanse of white and the whispering voice of the forest. By nightfall, they made camp under the shelter of a rocky overhang that blunted the wind's cruelest edge. Callan worked with practiced efficiency, gathering wood and striking flint to steel until embers glowed to life. Eleanor pulled the furs tighter around Annalise, observing as Samuel leaned in, watching Callan demonstrate how to stack the wood to create a steady, long-burning fire. She wanted to speak, to offer her thanks, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate on her tongue. Instead, she occupied herself preparing what little food remained. The dried meat was nearly gone, but Callan had brought fresh game, which he skinned and cleaned with meticulous precision. As the aroma of roasting meat filled the small clearing, Eleanor felt the first unfamiliar pang of relief. Annalise had warmed to him more quickly than Eleanor had anticipated. She sat beside him now, her small hands fiddling with the fringe on his coat, tracing the intricate beadwork sewn into the leather. He let her, unperturbed by her quiet inspection. When she shivered, he drew the edge of his own cloak around her without a word. Samuel was different. He sought to learn, to prove his own worth. He studied Callan's every action, from the way he tied a knot to how he carved the meat. He asked no questions, but simply observed, absorbing everything. Eleanor found herself watching as well. As night deepened, the firelight threw long, dancing shadows against the trees. Callan sat across from her, honing the edge of his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. His face remained unreadable, but there was a stillness about him, a profound patience she had never witnessed in another man. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Callan didn't break his rhythm. "My winter camp." She swallowed. "How far?" 2 days. The thought of 2 more days trekking through the snow made her stomach clench, but she forced a nod. Annalise had already succumbed to sleep, curled beneath the blankets. Samuel sat upright by the fire, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Eleanor reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Sleep," she murmured. He shook his head stubbornly. "I'm not tired." Callan glanced at him. "Rest is a form of strength." Samuel hesitated, then nodded and stretched out beside his sister. Eleanor waited until his breathing evened out before she allowed herself to exhale. The night was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. She felt the weight of Callan's gaze on her, steady and unwavering. "You do not trust me," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. She stiffened. "I don't trust anyone." His eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. "That is wise." She frowned. "Then why help us?" He was silent for a long moment, as if debating the merits of an answer. Finally, he sheathed his knife and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You are alone," he said simply. "I have seen what becomes of those left to fend for themselves." She swallowed, her fingers curling into the blanket over her lap. "And what do you ask in return?" His expression remained unchanged. "Nothing." She wanted to believe him, but her life had been a harsh teacher, and men, she had learned, never gave without taking. They sat in silence, the fire a warm barrier between them. The next day's journey was harder, the terrain growing more rugged. Eleanor's legs ached, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Kalen moved ahead, clearing their path, his presence a silent promise of security. They reached a river by midday, its surface a treacherous mosaic of solid ice and dark churning water. Kalen studied it for a moment before stepping onto the ice, testing its integrity. Eleanor's heart hammered. "Is it safe?" He nodded. "Step where I step." She took Samuel's hand and followed. The ice groaned beneath their feet. Annalise whimpered, burying her face in Eleanor's shoulder. Below them the river roared, dark and merciless. A sharp crack split the air. Her stomach plummeted. Samuel gasped as the ice under his foot gave way. Eleanor lunged, grabbing his arm just as Kalen moved with the speed of a striking hawk. His hand clamped around Samuel's wrist, hauling him back onto solid ice an instant before the river could claim him. Samuel trembled, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Kalen knelt before him, his hands firm on the boy's shoulders. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice calm and steady. "You are safe." Samuel swallowed hard and nodded. Eleanor's hands shook as she pulled her son close, her eyes meeting Kalen's over the boy's head. Her chest felt tight. "Thank you," she whispered. They crossed the remainder of the river with painstaking care. By the time they arrived at Kalen's winter camp, a profound exhaustion had settled deep into Eleanor's bones. The camp was nestled between towering rock formations that shielded it from the punishing wind. A small fire pit sat at its center, surrounded by simple but well-constructed shelters of wood and animal hide. Kalen moved with quiet purpose, setting down his pack and surveying their new surroundings. Samuel sat by the fire staring into the flames, while Annalise curled up beside him, her small body finally surrendering to fatigue. Eleanor hesitated before lowering herself onto the furs Kalen had spread out for them. "You are safe here," he said. She met his gaze, searching for any sign of falsehood, and finding none. For the first time in months, she believed it. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled beyond the rocky cliffs, Eleanor allowed herself to close her eyes. She did not dream of hunger. She did not dream of fear. She dreamed only of warmth. The days melted one into the next as winter asserted its dominion over the land. Kalen's camp became their sanctuary, a place of quiet perseverance. The nights were long and frigid, but they were secure, and that security, however fragile, was a solace she hadn't dared to imagine in her darkest moments. She watched her children begin to thrive. Samuel, though still reserved, moved with a new confidence, his curiosity now shaped by a practical understanding of the world around him. Annalise, too, began to laugh again, the sound soft at first, but genuine. Kalen moved through their days like a constant, steady presence, as immutable as the mountains that encircled them. He hunted when their provisions ran low, constructing traps and tracking game with a skill that left Eleanor in awe. His movements were always deliberate, his focus absolute, as if the entire world narrowed to those moments of stillness. Though he spoke little, she found herself observing him more and more, trying to comprehend the man who had understood her own plight so intuitively. She noted the small gestures of care for her children, the way he always ensured Annalise was warm before attending to his own tasks, or how he would patiently teach Samuel to carve wood when he thought no one was watching. And then there were the moments their eyes met across the fire, when an unspoken current passed between them, something she could not name and did not know if she was prepared to acknowledge. With each passing day, however, the heavy shroud of her grief began to lift, replaced by something quieter, more gentle. a sense of peace she had thought impossible after the life she had endured, after the loss that still haunted her. She didn't know if it was his presence or the land itself that had begun to heal her. Perhaps it was both. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility of a future not solely defined by what she had lost. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside their shelter, Kalen spoke to her about his past. It was late, the fire crackling low in the stone pit between them. Annalise was already asleep, her head resting against Samuel's side. Samuel himself was on the verge of slumber, his fingers still wrapped around the small, clumsy figure of a bear he had been carving. "You have lost much," Kalen said, his voice low and steady, as if he had carried the weight of his own history for a long time. Eleanor shifted but didn't look away from the flames. She had grown accustomed to the comfortable silence between them, but something in his tone tonight left her feeling vulnerable, exposed. "I have," she said quietly, her throat tight. She had not spoken of her husband's death since the day it happened. The wound was still too raw. But Kalen had seen her grief, and, in some way, he seemed to understand it without needing her to utter a single word. "Loss is a difficult burden, I know," he said. Eleanor nodded, uncertain of how to reply, but the truth in his words resonated deep within her. She turned her gaze to him, truly meeting his eyes. There was a depth there, an understanding born of experience, of a life lived in the shadow of sorrow and survival. "I thought I would never find peace again," she confessed softly. I thought the pain would never cease." Kalen was quiet for a long time, his eyes never leaving hers. Then slowly, he reached out, his hand gently brushing the back of hers. It was a small, simple gesture, but it sent a shock through her, making her heart race. It was the first time he had touched her with such intention, and it felt as though the world had tilted slightly on its axis, just enough to leave her breathless. "You will," he said, his voice gentle, "in time. But you must trust yourself, and you must learn to trust others again." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Trust. She had spent so long erecting walls around her heart, locking everyone out, convinced that to trust was to be vulnerable, to be hurt again. But here in this quiet corner of the world, with this man who had no obligation to protect her, she felt something stir, something raw and real. "I don't know if I can trust again," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I am strong enough." Kalen's fingers lingered on her hand for a moment longer, before he slowly withdrew, as though sensing her hesitation. "You are," he said simply, the conviction in his voice undeniable. "Strength has many forms. It is not always in fighting or in surviving. Sometimes it is in letting go. It is in opening your heart again, even when you fear it will break." Eleanor closed her eyes, his words washing over her like a gentle tide. For so long she had held on to her grief, her anger, her fear, believing they were the only things keeping her safe. But Kalen was right. Strength wasn't just about holding on, it was also about knowing when to let go, when to dare to trust again. The fire flickered between them, the heat warm on her skin. But it was the warmth that had bloomed between them that she felt most acutely. She had been so afraid of the world, so terrified of what might happen if she allowed herself to be vulnerable. But now, with Kalen beside her and her children sleeping safely under the firs, she realized that perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps there was more to life than fear. Perhaps there was room for hope. As the night wore on, she found herself leaning closer to him, drawn by the quiet strength that emanated from him, by the soft, unspoken promise in his gaze. And when he looked at her, truly looked at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding, only acceptance. Days turned into weeks, and with each one that passed, Eleanor found herself growing stronger. She learned to trust Kalen in ways she had never thought possible, watching him care for her children with a tenderness she hadn't expected. In return, she found herself opening up to him, piece by piece, the wall she had built around her heart slowly beginning to crumble. Not all at once, but in quiet, hesitant increments. One afternoon, as Kalen returned from a hunt, the sky heavy with the promise of another storm, Eleanor was waiting for him by the fire. A question had been sitting in her heart for days, and now, with the world quiet around them, it felt like the right moment to ask. "You said I would find peace, but what of you? What have you lost?" Kalen paused, looking at her with a gaze that seemed to reach deep inside her. His expression softened, and, for the first time, he shared a piece of his past with her, of the tribe he had lost, of the family taken from him by the ravages of war and disease. "In time, I lost them all," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "But I am not lost, not anymore." Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the quiet sorrow etched into his words. In that moment, she understood something profound. There was no end to loss, no finality to the pain it caused. But there was redemption in moving forward. There was hope in finding the strength to rebuild, to love again. As the storm rolled in, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames and the warmth of each other's presence filling the silence between them. For the first time in a long, long while, Eleanor allowed herself to believe in a future that could be different from the past, a future that might hold more than just survival. In Kalen's quiet strength, in his unwavering patience, she had found something she had thought impossible, a chance at redemption, and with it, a new beginning.